25 minutes, come dancing. First, the 9 o'clock news with Richard Whitmore.
The worst British air disaster for 13 years. 54 people are killed at Manchester Airport, trapped in a burning plane. Those who escaped talk of panic in the rush.
I was virtually out the door, and I couldn't breathe then. And there was all kinds of people screaming and shouting behind me. I don't know what happened to them.
The Prime Minister visits the injured and talks of the sorrow and the agony. And one other headline, no Daily Mirrors printed in London tonight, and the jobs of 4,000 staff are under threat. Good evening. 54 people were killed when a plane packed with families going on holiday burst into flames as it was about to take off from Manchester Airport. 17 of the 85 survivors have been kept in hospital. 5 are in intensive care, including 2 children. Many survivors spoke of mass panic as people tried to escape the fire. One said that people were falling onto the floor and getting trampled on. The British Air Tours Boeing 737 was accelerating down the runway to take off for the Greek island of Corfu when there was an explosion in the portside engine. The plane was brought to a halt, but fuel ignited in a second huge explosion and flames spread from wing to tail. It split in 2, and most of those who died were sitting in the back of the aircraft. Firemen said the heat was so intense that the plane just melted.
This was Manchester Airport's worst disaster, and the engine breakup crippled the Boeing within 40 seconds. Miraculously for the 83 survivors, Captain Peter Terrington slewed his aircraft to a stop just a few hundred yards from the base of a brigade kitted out with the world's most up-to-date firefighting equipment. It meant that high-expansion foam was smothering the blaze within seconds. As the investigators began their meticulous inspection, a clear picture of the sequence of the tragedy became clear. First, there was an uncontained explosion inside the port engine. Part of that engine fractured the fuel tanks in the wing, saturating the fuselage with gallons of kerosene. The pilots switched off power immediately, but with a full load of fuel aboard for the Boeing's longest possible journey, the spray was lethal.
All the petrol spilled out onto the runway, and that was on fire, and all down one side of the plane was on fire. But the fumes were just bellowing into the plane itself. I was more or less getting out, and I couldn't breathe. I was virtually out the door, and I couldn't breathe then. And there was all kinds of people screaming and shouting behind me. I don't know what happened to them.
How quickly were you able to get off?
Pretty quick, like all the stewards and all like that, they're just trying to quieten everyone down and get everyone over, because they were diving over the seats and stuff like that. I know everyone was pushing from behind, and people were falling on the floor and getting trampled on and everything. And you could hear everyone shouting behind you.
There's no way you could help them?
There's no way, because you could, if you'd turned around, everyone had just, you know, trampled all over you. So like they would, as I was turning around to have a look back, I just felt someone grab me, and the steward was pulling me out and just threw me out of the plane.
We thought it was going to blow up because it's full of fuel. The tanks must have burst because there's a lot of fuel went onto the runway, and people were sort of like panicking, saying, people saying get back in your seat, so everybody sat back down. But we thought it'd go out with the extinguishers on the plane. And basically straight away the foam tenders come and started spraying it. That was basically probably within a minute and a half of it happening. And someone got the doors open, it was just a big rush get out. But we looked back and we could see flames come into the cabin, and smoke coming along the roof. As soon as the smoke hit you, it was like a brick wall.
The injured survivors were taken to Wythenshawe Hospital, where the emergency service burns unit was on full alert and operating immediately. Those who were trapped were brought to a temporary morgue in an airport hangar. Tonight, bereaved relatives are beginning the awful task of identifying the victims. It's clear that the fire, which produced temperatures above 500 degrees centigrade inside the plane, virtually severed the tail section. The flames engulfed the aircraft from wing to tail. Firemen managed to help several badly burned passengers escape, but for others there was no chance. Already 3 plane loads of investigators are on the scene. The pilot and the co-pilot are undergoing the most thorough debriefing. Their description of the trail of events, plus the debris picked up from the runway and the black box recordings recovered from the wreckage, will provide the basis for an eventual explanation of the tragedy. But for passengers on flight KT-328, satisfactory investigations will never obliterate the minutes of horror. Tonight, a huge crane lifted the aircraft from the taxiway. It was trundled slowly to a side apron while the investigators arranged for the complete wreck to be shipped to their laboratories at Farnborough. Now, Manchester Airport is almost ready to resume the job this crash cruelly interrupted.
There have been many messages of sympathy for the bereaved and the injured, including one from the Queen. She said she'd been distressed to hear of the dreadful accident and the large loss of life. And the Prime Minister went straight to the scene.
Mrs. Thatcher came straight to the scene of the crash from her holiday in Austria. She spent nearly half an hour on the tarmac and inspected the charred wreckage at close quarters. She was accompanied by her husband Dennis, the Transport Under-Secretary David Mitchell and the British Airways Chief Executive Colin Marshall. But she spent much of her time chatting to firemen and those with the grim task of checking every piece of the wreckage. The Prime Minister expressed her deepest sympathy and sorrow for the relatives of the dead and said everything possible was being done to find the cause of the disaster.
When we get a terrible air crash of this kind, everyone is appalled and shocked, of course they are. Because you just think, well, supposing we were on that aircraft and looking forward to where we were going, and then all of a sudden this happened. And of course your minds are very imaginatively filled with the horror of the situation and the tragedy of the families. But you know, thousands and thousands of aircraft fly safely.
Back in the airport building, she met some of the British Air Tour's stewardesses who were on the fatal flight and heard graphic accounts of the terrifying moments when flames engulfed the plane.
Well, we had a man with a child of 22 months and a little girl about this big, and he was sat by an emergency window and he had this sense within seconds to open the window. He got out onto the wing, took his daughter to the grass side, then went back in, got his wife and his baby out, and everyone followed him.
Then it was on to Wythenshawe Hospital a few miles away, where doctors have treated more than 80 casualties for shock and burns. The Prime Minister spent over an hour talking to the staff, the patients and their relatives.
Lots of relatives, children, parents, friends. Sorrow and agony is the only word for it.
Mrs. Thatcher returned to London, obviously moved by what she'd seen and heard from the many whose lives have been touched by this tragedy.
British Air Tour's flight KT-328 was booked by 4 travel companies, 3 of them owned by British Airways, Enterprise, Flair and Martin Rooks. Other seats on the plane had been booked by a Liverpool firm, Duggan Travel. Greater Manchester Police have set up telephone lines to deal with emergency inquiries from people with relations on the flight. The numbers are 061 for people outside Manchester, 228 26 8567 or 8. British Air Tours have also provided a number for relations to ring. It's 01 if you're outside London, 897 6333. Investigations have already begun into the cause of today's disaster, and there are several questions to answer. What went wrong with the plane's engine, and could more people have escaped from the devastating fire? It was just after 7 o'clock this morning when flight KT-328 began its takeoff run. It was in the critical phase just before liftoff when the pilot reported trouble with his engine. This photograph, taken by a member of the public, shows how the plane began to catch fire. Then came an explosion, and smoke and flames poured from the engine. The plane was travelling at nearly 110 miles an hour. The pilot aborted the takeoff, deliberately slewing the plane round to a point near the airport fire station. 2 firemen struggled aboard and began helping the passengers escape. Then came a second explosion as gallons of fuel ignited. The firemen were blown out of the plane, one in flames. A fireball swept through the rear of the cabin, and it was then that most of the victims died. It took only a few minutes.
Today's tragedy may have begun with foreign object damage caused by debris being sucked up from the runway into the jet engine. It may even have been birds which flew into the path of the jet intake. Whatever it was, something caused the engine to explode. Witnesses say there were 2 loud bangs in quick succession. One possibility is that the fan blades on one of the turbines broke off, bursting through the protective container around the engine and slashing through the fuel tanks in the wing and belly of the aircraft. Because there was fuel gushing out, the situation was far more dangerous once the plane came to a stop. The usual practice in a catastrophic incident of this kind is for the cabin crew immediately to open the automatic doors at the front and rear and begin evacuation. But one survivor claims passengers were told to remain seated. It's not yet clear how long it took for the emergency doors to be opened. Once the evacuation was started, it was through the front doors and over the wings. Today's survivors confirmed there was a lot of panic. In theory, the Boeing 737, like any other airliner, can be emptied within 90 seconds through only half the exits. Evacuations are regularly practiced by cabin crews. It's drummed into them that passengers are often hesitant, confused and frightened. So passengers have to be urged and, if necessary, pushed or even thrown out. That training will have saved many lives this morning.
The situation is such that when the evacuation is called, and quite often the passengers are in a state of stress then to prevent people panicking and surging about and going, the cabin staff would have taken a firm control and said, stay where you are and I'll help you out. And as they came to the exit, assisted people down and out of the aeroplane on the slides.
And we've heard that there was some panic amongst the passengers on the aircraft, which is understandable. Do you think that that could have led to one or other of passengers opening doors which they shouldn't have done?
This is always a possibility. There are cases which can be quoted from past events like this where exits have been opened by passengers and exits on the side where the fire have been opened, and fire and fumes have managed to get into the aeroplane in that way. That is a possibility in this case.
The Boeing 737 is in the top 3 in the World Airliner Safety League. In 18 years, out of more than it, there have been only 14 fatal crashes. The cause of this crash won't be known until departure at Farnborough and analyse the flight recorders. Statistically, flying in airliners is still one of the safest methods of travel, but it's almost certain that the inquiry will include recommendations to make it even safer in the future.
Many survivors today spoke of the difficulty of getting out of their seats to the doors in the crowded plane. Their escape was also impeded by thick smoke and rapidly spreading flames from the burning aviation fuel. They are hazards which the airlines are going to great lengths to remove.
In the busiest time of the year for charter airlines, British Air Tours are one of the busiest. But their charter planes are specially adapted to squeeze in 7 passengers in 19 rows with 3 seats either side of the aisle. A charter flight carries 130 passengers in 22 rows. They've got 3 inches less than scheduled passengers between them and the seat in front. But that doesn't mean they're any more dangerous. Strict rules say that both types of plane must be able to evacuate all their passengers within 90 seconds. More controversial than where the seats are is what they're made from. That's mostly polyurethane foam cushions which burn fumes. New flame-inhibiting material is now being tested to successfully withstand temperatures as to be treated, although just a few planes so far, and not yet the Boeing involved in the disaster at Manchester Airport. The flammable fuel was a serious source of fire. ICI are testing additives to reduce the risk of fire breaking out. But today, ICI couldn't say whether their fuel additive would have saved lives by stopping the fire breaking out aboard the plane at Manchester Airport.
Today's tragedy is the 4th major air disaster in the last 2 months. Altogether, more than 1,000 people have lost their lives, making this one of the worst years on record for air safety. In June, an Air India Boeing 747 with 329 people aboard crashed off the coast of Ireland. There were no survivors. Earlier this month, a Delta Airlines TriStar crashed during a storm near the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in Texas. 134 people were killed. And then 10 days ago, a Japan Airlines jumbo jet crashed into a mountain near Tokyo, killing 520 people. That was the world's worst single aircraft disaster. However, none of these accidents has any common cause, and industry experts say flying is still one of the safest forms of travel. And now the rest of the news. Publication in London of the Daily Mirror and its sister papers, The Sporting Life, Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, was suspended tonight by the proprietor, Mr. Robert Maxwell. He complained about anarchic action by members of the print union, the NGA. He said that on Wednesday night this action had cost the Mirror 750,000 copies. Mr. Maxwell bought the Mirror Group for £113 million last year, and since then he's had difficulties persuading the print unions to accept new manning proposals. Last night's disruption was caused by a union meeting held to discuss plans to move production of The Sporting Life to a contract printer.
The dispute has been sparked off by a management plan to move the printing of The Sporting Life from here in the centre of London at Mirror Group headquarters to elsewhere in London. Members of the print union, the National Graphical Association, held what Mr. Maxwell calls a disruptive meeting last night, costing the Mirror 750,000 copies. Mr. Maxwell says that all 150 members of the National Graphical Association who attended that meeting are now to consider themselves to have dismissed themselves. The future, he says, of the other 4,500 staff who work here at Mirror Group headquarters is now under doubt. At the headquarters of Mirror Group...